My name is Don Deers. I'm the moderator for this session. We have a great panel, and their bios are in the brochure, so I'm not going to go through them in any detail. Myron Ebel yesterday kept referring to Jeff Immelt and made a number of what might be viewed as derogatory comments. In the spirit of disclosure, I must admit I am a retired GE company senior executive, and I do not happen to like where the GE stock is today at $7 a share. But anyway, I thought that this one slide from one of my presentations might set the stage for the discussion on CO2 emissions, climate change, and economics. And as you can see from this, if we have to reduce our CO2 emissions by 80%, total CO2 emissions by 80%, this chart shows the total plus the emissions from each sector, you'll see that we have to reduce them down to about 1,000, just under 1,000 million metric tons. And that happens to be about the level of CO2 emissions in the United States during World War I. Now, we have to do that at the same time that our population is increasing. And in fact, according to the Census Bureau, from between the year 2000 and 2050, our population is going to grow by 139 million. Now, there's another interesting correlation there, and that is that the total population of the United States during World War II was 139 million. So I think this sets the stage for the enormous task ahead of us if we have to go through this process of reducing CO2 emissions by 80%. So I'd like to introduce first speaker, Michelle Foss, from the University of Texas.
Okay, that's good enough.
All right.
Just escape.
Right.
And then
You're all set. Right.
okay. Okay. I wasn't here yesterday, which I regret. I was actually in London at another conference. What I wanted to do was having missed the content yesterday, just lay out a few ideas to set up the other two speakers and try to wrap some things together, considering that this is basically the last panel today. And it will reflect some of the thinking that's going on in our own shop. I come from a university, from a large energy producing state, and I'm based in the Bureau of Economic Geology, which is the state survey, and which also has a very large carbon sequestration project effort, and led the Texas competition in the FutureGen Clean Coal program last year. Some of you may recall that what happened was at the end, the program was abandoned because the cost structure for the technology that was at the core of the program, Integrated Gasification Combined Cycle, ICCC, for those of you who follow this stuff, combined with CO2 capture and sequestration, ended up with a price tag of about $1.8 billion, and the plant that we would have built in Texas would have yielded only about 250 megawatts of power, which didn't seem like a very good deal to anyone at the time. Now, Illinois, which ended up winning the competition but didn't have any money, does have the money via the unnamed earmark for clean coal, which was in the stimulus package that got approved a little bit ago. And so it goes. This is the story of not only energy economics and politics in the United States, but I think a lot of what we have to worry about and deal with on the climate side. When we look at this issue of the economic side of climate, we view it as an insurance policy issue. We're pricing the insurance option. What are we willing to pay for that insurance option? How do we view the risk? If we view the risk in an extraordinarily strong way, then we may be willing to pay a lot. The greater the risk and uncertainty associated with the risk that we're trying to deal with, the tougher it gets to figure out how to price the insurance option in the first place, right? And then you end up with a question that I think Francisco's going to deal with more in more detail, which is whether it's fair to impose on society a large cost for something that is a very low probability risk that no one fully understands in the first place. That's really the essence of the dilemma that we're facing on the economic side, and we think is the problem underlying decisions about whether we should do anything at all, specifically to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Is this the best thing to do? Does it yield the best value back to society? Do we have other choices, other things that we can be doing that would actually improve society more than this policy action would, and actually make us better off and better able to do other things, which in the previous session was actually a very good point that was raised that we look at all of the time. Richer people are able to afford lots of things. Poor people can't. So we should grow the wealth of nations rather than try to restrict it or limit it, because that gives us more ability to afford the new things, the new technologies that we might want to get into the mix anyway. So that's kind of how we look at this problem internally in our group. And in talking to a bunch of Houston business folks the other day, and remember, I am Houston, I am Texas, so therefore we have this problem of preaching to the choir at home, because as one of the European consuls pointed out to me lately, Houston seems to be the place where people continue to be skeptical about this. And I said, well, good reason. You look around town, Houston is full of scientists, technology experts, engineers, people who understand the dilemmas in science, understand the dilemmas in measuring and projecting scenarios and modeling and problems with modeling. And so, of course, we're going to be one of the most skeptical places when it comes to this whole thing. So, you know, our skepticism revolves around whether we know enough to even conduct the actuarial analysis in the first place to price the insurance option. Can we even assess the risks in order to figure out what we might be willing to pay for that insurance policy? Do we know enough about the technology options and costs to even make policy in the first place? The FutureGen experience for us was an overwhelmingly educational experience in the complexities of trying to scale up some of the things that we're talking about trying to do. It's going to take 50 years before anything like that, if that's what we really want, can really work the right way to deliver value to energy customers in our country or anywhere, really. A big question, can we make policy in a sensible way so that it's efficient and effective? We don't have a very good track record for that when it comes to any area that we delve into. And then, of course, this remaining question of whether climate is the right priority. I don't know if anyone has brought this up in the conference, but I felt that this was important, even if it has come up, to say it again. There's a piece of work floating around out there by a Harvard-based professor in economics that has been getting a lot of attention. For instance, I was visiting with some folks from the Peterson Institute here in New York, and they have really bought into this thing. If you look at the probability distribution of events, a typical bell curve, the things that have the greatest chance of occurring are in the middle. These are the things that we deal with on a normal day-to-day basis. The risk that a parent might have an accident or an early death, and kids have to be taken care of through some sort of financial means. Okay, we all buy insurance to protect ourselves from that. The chance that we pull out of our garage at home and somebody's car smacks into us, there's a pretty high probability of that happening, so we can buy insurance for that. The issue is the tails. The tails are low probability events. Sometimes those low probability events can have high consequences. The probability of a hurricane hitting Houston is actually pretty low. The consequence of a major hurricane hitting Houston is not very much fun. So what do you do to protect yourself and harden your local economy and your local infrastructure against that type of event? What Weitzman has started to argue is that when it comes to climate, the tail events are so catastrophic. He uses the phrase destruction of the earth in all of his research papers, and people have picked up on that. The tail events, the low probability events, are so catastrophic, this is so big for society, that it's worth to pay a lot. It's worth to pay as much as we can possibly pay to implement CO2 reduction strategies that will remove trace gases from the atmosphere and insure us against the possibility that this stuff might happen. This is a perverse argument. I'm going to leave it to Francisco to tell you about how perverse it is and how distorting it can be in terms of social welfare and other things. But this is the new twist. This is what we're battling. When I was in Washington last week working on some stuff, everyone is talking about this. And this is the thing that has filtered into the debate. And we have a lot of experience in our group in talking with people and trying to educate people on risk assessment, perception of risk, understanding risk. And I know how difficult it is to sit down with people and talk to them about low risk, high consequence events. This is the stuff that everybody worries about to an extraordinary degree. We worry a lot less, amazingly, about the higher risk but lower consequence events. Pulling out of the garage and getting smacked by a car. Or, if you're young, not buying health insurance and then winding up in an emergency room with someone else having to pay for your care. I mean, that's sort of where we are in how people think about this. Well, in all of the debate at our university about climate modeling, one of the things that I know is that if you try to figure out what the tail of the event is and deal with this insurance option pricing problem in the right way, you don't get much guidance. One of our climate researchers, Charles Jackson, has been working a lot on whether and how climate models can actually be improved, and he has basically told us that he's hit the wall on this, or that the modeling community has hit the wall on this. And so as an economist, I'm not even going to get much better advice from the climate modeling community, which only increases the risk and uncertainty associated with these catastrophic events, tail events. Models vary in results for a host of reasons. The computational cost of trying to build a climate model that can factor in every possible part of the climate system in an accurate way is huge. Part of Charles's research agenda in working on this for his sponsors was to try to figure out how you bring that cost down. It's very, very difficult to bring that cost down. And so the argument gets strengthened. Should we err on the side of caution? Should we simply implement policy in order to offset the chance that catastrophic events can take place? So one of the things that we see happening is the inability to actually understand climate better and the inability to get people to focus correctly on the climate system in the first place is feeding into the argument that maybe it's better to absorb the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, since we don't know anything better than what we know at present, which is unfortunately not very helpful. Now, a bunch of people have looked at climate models, and you can go anywhere and see what different groups have said. The one that we keep coming back to is the Stern Review from the United Kingdom, because it was so strong, and the only way that they were able to generate the results they got in their economic analysis was to assume the worst case. We hosted a seminar for the Stern team in Houston when the report was launched last year, and it was very easy to pick holes in that analysis, and it has been very easy for economists to pick holes in that analysis, yet it is now the gold standard. This is what everybody looks at. It is the basis for decision making, the basis for arguments in Europe. It has become the basis for arguments over here, and it's very hard to get people to understand how it's put together and how strong the assumptions are in order to make this work. In their view, this is basically, the Stern Review is basically an embodiment of the precautionary principle. It's worth it to spend up to 1% of GDP now in order to prevent much larger costs later on if we don't do anything, and it sells. This argument sells very strongly. Now, of course, balancing that is the reality in what the Stern team advocates, a cap-and-trade system of price for carbon. Last spring, after the Stern team came to Houston, carbon prices were still roughly in the 40s, 30 to 40 euros in European trading. They're now about 8. Clearly, carbon prices follow energy commodity prices, which is what you would expect. From, I could tell you, a development community point of view, an investment point of view in Houston, nobody is going to be comfortable putting billions of dollars at risk with that kind of volatility in a new market. Companies already struggle to put billions of dollars of investment at risk in the commodity markets that we think we sort of understand, crude oil, natural gas, and so on. So there's a great deal of reluctance to move forward with this unless there's a huge amount of cover from federal dollars to offset what companies are risking in shareholder value, or other policy levers that might help to absorb some of the risk that the investors would take in new technologies that are unproven and undemonstrated in order to achieve the greenhouse gas mitigation targets that people think they want. Now, as I said, we've looked most closely at the wedge using the Princeton BP model that has been around quite a bit. The wedge that entails capturing CO2 and pushing it back into the ground in long-term storage in order to develop a mitigation strategy. Clearly, in pursuing these kinds of alternatives, what's being targeted are emissions from big point sources, like electric power generation. In our electric power generation mix, the biggest point source is coal-fired generation. And so that's why schemes like FutureGen have evolved, because it links the use of coal, which everyone thinks is still important for U.S. energy security, with a carbon capture and sequestration strategy to try to make the use of coal acceptable in a world that worries about greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I've done a little back-of-the-envelope analysis and using a quote from Roy Spencer that I really like a lot: 5 quadrillion tons of atmospheric volume, have figured out that if we sequestered all of the CO2 produced from all of the U.S. coal-fired power generation, we would be capturing and taking out of the atmosphere a whopping, what is that, 300 thousandths or 3 millionths of a percent? I can't even read my zeros. But that's the actual contribution that we're making in a situation in which basically we're dealing with a trace gas, and we're trying to figure out what the cost is of sequestering, removing more of what is already a trace gas from the atmosphere to reduce whatever minimal effect it's already could be responsible for. And if further we were to take all the CO2 generated by all of human activities as a percentage of atmosphere and try to capture that and sequester that, it's a little bit better. The, what is that, 16 millionths, 1600 thousandths, 16 ten thousandths of a percent of contribution to the atmosphere. This is what a CCS value chain looks like. This is what you have to be able to do in order to make this work. Now, we have one sort of downside in this picture, which is that for Texas, capturing CO2 from a coal-fired power plant has a lot of value when it comes to enhanced oil recovery. So what everyone in the state wants to do is take CO2 and pump it into old oil fields in order to extract more oil from those existing assets. Unfortunately, that's not very popular with the environmental groups, and so we've had EDF and NRDC and everybody else running around the state, trying to convince lawmakers that in addition to a practical commercial value chain solution, CO2 EOR, that we also need to think about investing in long-term permanent storage in all the brine aquifers that we happen to have on the Gulf Coast, which is a tough sell because that's sheer cost. You're drilling a well, pumping stuff down into a brine aquifer that isn't going to do anything for anyone. So we're trying to figure out how on earth you pay for that. You have to have insurance, liability protection, transfer of title, property rights, regulatory oversight, monitoring and verification, certification that if you're actually sequestering CO2 in a CO2 EOR project, you can prove to someone that you've really done that so that that has value in a carbon trading market. Building the institutional infrastructure to go along with this, we estimated at the time that we were working on this, would take about 30 years. 30 years before you had an environment, a regulatory framework, a legal regulatory framework that could support commercial scale CO2 EOR. And the cost is not wonderful. Our estimate per ton of captured carbon all the way to injection is anywhere from $65 to $120 a ton based on information provided to us by the companies themselves who are looking at the cost of technology, the challenges in doing this. Right now, if you're an oil producer in West Texas, you're paying about $30 a ton for natural CO2 in order to be able to keep your enhanced oil recovery project going. There's a huge problem in the model, which is parasitic load loss. If I build a power plant using coal, and I'm going to capture CO2 from that power plant, I'm going to be giving up about 30% of the power from that asset to capture that CO2, which means I have to build a power plant that's at least 30% larger, and probably more than that, in order to be able to make the whole thing work. This is a really huge problem in terms of assessing these technologies. Of course, costs for building electric power systems, any kind of energy infrastructure, skyrocketed at the time we were doing this. Costs have come down some, labor, raw materials, and so on, but they haven't come down by a lot because everyone is expecting cost pressure to go back up again as demand for energy increases when we come out of the economic malaise that we've been in. The big selling point on this whole thing has been green jobs, which Jay is going to talk about. I love this quote because it captured for us the problem of the whole green jobs debate. Using wind to revitalize the Rust Belt, making steel in order to be able to make our own wind turbine columns. We have a lot of wind power in Texas that we've had to figure out how to deal with. And when I look at these kinds of claims and projections, I try to imagine building a new blast furnace to make steel in the United States could be just as difficult as doing any of the other things that we're talking about. We've looked at a set of green jobs forecasts. There are huge problems in these things, not least of which trying to figure out what actually constitutes a green job. And when we've talked to Texas lawmakers, we find that people are throwing things around all over the place. Is an oil worker, an oil field worker who is engaged in a CO2 EOR sequestration project, a brown worker or a green worker? You tell me. I don't know. There's no way to classify that. One thing we do know is that if you build an economic model and you push a lot of money into it to create jobs, you're going to create a lot of jobs. It doesn't really matter what kind they are. And so we've concluded that most of the green jobs forecasts overstate the case, which we've had the unfortunate job of trying to explain to our Texas lawmakers, any lawmaker in any state, any mayor, any governor right now who thinks that this is one way to come out of the recession that we're in. The worst problem is that when people look at these things, they're not evaluating the costs associated with this kind of transition. All they're looking at are the benefits, and so that's one thing that causes the models to be overblown. To close, this is a wonderful diagram. This was put together by the National Association of Manufacturers at the heat of the Lieberman-Warner and then Boxer debate last year before the bill finally crashed and burned. So to my point about being skeptical about efficient policy making, I have absolutely no confidence that we can put together any sort of a greenhouse gas targeted policy in the United States that would not be so full of stuff that the administrative costs would overwhelm any benefit that anyone would be expected to get out of it. And I think that, lurking around Capitol Hill, I can detect now some reticence to plunge back into this based on the experience of getting this thing together before. This was for the National Association of Manufacturers. This was SAIC's own estimate of what it would cost to implement, not with the Boxer Amendment, even just the first version, Lieberman-Warner, more than $200 a ton by 2030. Remember, I told you the maximum amount that we looked at on CO2 sequestration projects was $120 a ton. And the carbon market is $8 a ton. So that gives you a feel for the scope of the economic dilemma on all of this stuff. So, to close, one of my favorite things as an economist to look at is what Bjorn Lomborg, we're Bjorn Lomborg fans in my group, has done through the Copenhagen Consensus. And my hope is that when Senator Boxer gets ready to go to Copenhagen, she might spend just a little time in her schedule talking to Dr. Lomborg. I doubt that she will. I think that would be pretty radical for her. But if she did, what she would learn about is a very interesting experiment 5 years or so now running in which a panel of very nice, high-placed economists, Nobel Prize winners, lots of top people, are given a budget and asked how to spend the money in that budget. No one ever puts global warming at the top of the list. The best they come up with is clean energy, R&D investment, which I think is about 14th in the list, investing in low-carbon technologies, which is kind of tough to argue we shouldn't do some of. So that's kind of how we see things on the economic side. I hope that it helps the other two panel members and also helps our discussion later on in terms of thinking about how to think about all of this part of the climate debate. Thanks.